Hello and welcome to Code Red. I'm excited to be joining you as one of our new hosts. Now, don't worry, Merkel will still be hosting as well. We're just bringing more voices into the mix to explore some new topics on Code Red. As I take the mic, I want to dive a bit deeper into the technical side and to highlight the community aspects of observability. Today, we are going to start by talking about how you can contribute to OpenTelemetry, both from a technical side, but also from a community perspective. Today's episode is all about platform engineering and developer experience on Kubernetes. Today's guest is Mauricio Salatino. Mauricio is an open source software and ecosystem engineer at Diagrid, a long-time contributor to projects like Dapper and Knative, an ex-member of the Knative steering committee, co-chair of the Tech Developer Experience, and the author of the book Platform Engineering on Kubernetes. Today, we will talk about what developer experience on Kubernetes really means, how platform engineering principles apply in the real world, how abstractions like Dapper help reduce cognitive load, and where observability fits for developers, and how GenAI is starting to shape the next evolution of platforms. So, Mauricio, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Kasper. I'm really happy to be here. This is a pleasure, and I'm pretty sure that we will have a fun conversation around those topics. I'm really passionate about that, so I think that we have a lot of things to discuss.
Yeah, me too. So let's kick things off with our traditional question. What
Mhm.
has been your biggest code red moment, an incident, failure, or challenge in your work with Kubernetes or
Yeah.
platform engineering that sort of changed how you think?
I think that for me, like as you mentioned before, I've been contributing to CNCF projects for quite a while, and I really like the idea of going to different projects and understanding how different communities tackle different challenges. And that has put me in a position where I do help a lot of customers, like other companies, to deal with these kind of like code red moments where they are having like reliability issues, scalability issues. But most of the time, I just engage with customer teams trying to solve those problems. So I try to help them to go through that. But personally, when you ask the question, I cannot stop thinking about like writing the book about the Kubernetes ecosystem. When I wrote the book Platform Engineering on Kubernetes, it was really challenging to keep up with the Kubernetes community, all the things that were changing in the landscape, and how projects integrated with each other. And for me, that made me reflect quite a lot. And you can see that in the book itself, that part of the big challenge of platform engineering is to keep up.
Oh,
Now
yes.
with AI, this is extremely changing, and it's changing fast. So how do you keep up while you build stuff that needs to support whatever it's going to be built tomorrow? And I think that that's kind of like one of the things that have changed my perception on how do I tackle problems and how do I implement solutions for that.
That totally makes sense, especially now, like with I think the CNCF projects is over 200 now, right? So
Yeah.
it's so many things that you as a platform engineer or even a developer to some extent needs
Mhm.
to like be up to date on, right? It's it's
Yeah.
it's crazy.
And you cannot know about everything, right? So you need to find ways of delegating and making the right decisions so you can adapt quickly to whatever comes next,
Yeah,
right? And I
exactly.
think that that's the key nowadays in whatever you're doing.
Awesome. So before we dive deeper, could you introduce yourself a bit for our listeners and tell us about your current role and your focus areas?
Yeah, 100%. So I'm working as an ecosystem engineer for a company that's called Diagrid. Diagrid was created to build products around and on top of the Dapper open source project, which is a project that was born inside of Microsoft to provide abstraction from infrastructure. Right? The idea is you have APIs to talk to infrastructure, your cloud infrastructure, your on-prem infrastructure. So then you can build applications on top of that infrastructure without being tied to a given specific provider, right? The example that we use quite a lot is Kafka and RabbitMQ or Pulsar, and the like the message brokers on cloud providers like Amazon SQS or Google PubSub. The idea is you build applications once against a core set of APIs, and then you can move your application across environments quite easily. And because we expose APIs at the same time, you have like implemented like cross-cutting concerns behind those APIs, like observability, security, reliability, all core things that most platform engineers want to provide to teams nowadays. By working on the Dapper project, I learned a lot about those topics specifically, and that's kind of like one of the main reasons why I've been collaborating with Casper on the observability side of things. Being Dapper CNCF project and exposing open telemetry metrics and data, we need to make sure that worked quite well with other telemetry and observability providers. So yeah, it's been quite fun.
As Mauricio mentioned, we have been working together a little bit on observability space of the Dapper. We've done a few talks, and we'll be doing a few talks in the spring as well. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. So you're the author of this platform engineering on Kubernetes book, right?
Mhm.
And you already mentioned a little bit about it in sort of the intro. But
Yeah.
can you like explain a little bit about what originally motivated you to write this book, and what problem
Yeah.
do you sort of consistently see in organizations struggling with adopting Kubernetes?
It's not that I woke up one day and I said I will write a book on platform engineering on Kubernetes, right? Like I remember this was like 2021 when I presented the project to the publisher, basically. It wasn't named like that because what I had in mind is basically a book about how the landscape, like the CNCF landscape, can be combined to create something that provides much more value than just plain Kubernetes, right? And what I've been doing until that point was to try different projects with different customers or different implementations, and then see how different tools were helping that customer or that company to solve a very specific problem. But most of them were focusing on the same projects and then trying to integrate them together. And after doing that for 5 7 times, I thought, okay, now I have like a lot of examples on these 20 projects. All the companies are like converging on the same point of saying, like, at least these 5 projects we are all using. So it kind of made sense to write a book just showing that combination of projects and how teams can, actually do that, and why it's going to save them so much time to combine these things together instead of just making up your own solutions for that. So the book came about that story, just telling that story, and then showing the examples that I've been working on a GitHub repo about like all these technologies and how they can be combined together. By the end, it took me 2 years to write. Like I published it in 2023, and by the end it's a compendium of 20 different CNCF tools and other open source tools, and how they can be used together to create something that provides much better value for organizations. And it's super fun because when I published it, there are kind of like other initiatives starting just to do the same thing and to prove that the combination of projects made a lot of sense. So yeah, it was well received, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it was very timely, right? I remember back in, I think it was at KubeCon in San Diego, where Brian
Mhm.
Lyles had a keynote around and mentioning Kubernetes being a platform for building other products,
Yep.
other platforms.
Hmm.
I think this resonated at least to me as well. Back then,
Yeah.
I was a platform engineer or a DevOps
Yeah.
engineer or SRE engineer, whatever we called it back in
Yeah.
those days. So I think this makes a lot of sense because at that point in time, CNCF was ramping up on projects, and you as a platform engineer needed to, like as you mentioned in the beginning, learn and learn and learn new projects, figuring out how to stitch them together. And I think one of the key things that's also struck with me in the book is that you sort of position Kubernetes as the foundation rather than the platform itself. Can you, based on experience, where do teams mostly like go wrong in this? That saying, "Hey, we have a Kubernetes platform, and then we're all okay."
Okay, so there are like tons of different things there. I think that like assuming that the journey will be easy is the most common one. Like saying, "Oh, no, we will just use Kubernetes and that's it," right? By just adopting kind of like that position, like saying we will just adopt Kubernetes and that's it, you are missing out on all the other tools that you will need to be efficient, right? And by not understanding how difficult it is, you will spend a lot of time thinking that you can deal with it, like building a platform or just managing Kubernetes at scale easily with small team. But actually, what you will realize is that you need a lot of experts on that space to actually do it correctly. So I think that like underestimating how difficult it is kind of like one of the key challenges. Nowadays, of course, 2026 is much easier than what it was in 2021. There are tons of things that now actually works like out of the box that before you needed to spend quite a bit of time. And then I guess that the normal thing of saying, well, we will replace what we have today for Kubernetes, and not thinking about like that developer experience or how like operations teams are going to manage this and observe kind of like the behavior of this kind of like very complex orchestrator. So that's kind of like the gist of it, like complexity, I guess. And then understanding for me, like one of the drivers of writing the book is for people to focus on the ecosystem more than on Kubernetes, more on than the project itself, right? Because tons of big companies have said like, let's do Kubernetes and Kubernetes only, and then you spend like 3-4 years building all the tools that are already there in the ecosystem. So keeping an eye on the ecosystem is extremely helpful.
Yeah, and if you're only working with Kubernetes, right, you also need to have like a lot of experts on Kubernetes hired,
Yeah.
and maybe that's not like the best time spent for developers to actually learn Kubernetes in and out, rather than
Mhm.
building abstractions on top, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen tons of companies that were moving from like a developer focused platform like Foundry or Heroku to Kubernetes, and that's a huge gap there, right? One of the things that I'm surprised still is that we didn't come up with something like that yet. But it feels like it's coming, and now with AI again, that's changing a little bit. And I think that that's good.
It's actually funny that you mentioned this, because one of the other things that Brian Lyles mentioned in this talk back in 2019 was that Kubernetes needed its Rails moment. For me, at least, I think platform engineering is sort of like driving towards creating a Rails moment for Kubernetes. At least that's the idea, to simplify and create abstractions for developers to make it as easy as possible and have that Rails moment. And on that topic, I think you're also writing right now, or working on a new book around developer experience on Kubernetes. Can you talk a little bit about what that means? What is developer experience in this context?
Yeah, from my perspective is I think that developer experience it's all about like how many tools as a developer you need to know in order to build applications that will run on top of Kubernetes, right? And how much of the ecosystem, how much of the process do you need to understand in order to get things done? The book that we're writing with Thomas Vitale is all about that. Is how do we improve both the software development inner loop and the outer loop to make sure that the burden is not on developers, right? Because again, that's a common challenge that I see on companies going the Kubernetes route, is that saying, okay, you are a developer, now you need to understand how Kubernetes works, and you need to create deployments and like all the manifest for deploying your applications there, and then understand how Kubernetes will run your applications. So that influence a lot on how do you develop your applications, like the architecture, but also the tools that you need to use in your local setup and in your inner loop in order to actually match what's expected on the other side, right? So the book is all about that: which tools will make you more efficient, what practices will make you more efficient. And now with AI coming really, really hard, it's like if code generation is not like something that humans will do, what do we need to provide agents with in order to just have exactly the same things that we have as humans to be more efficient, right? And that's tooling. That's again, like how do you write tests? What kind of tests do you write, and which tools do you use for that? Again, it's just more about like efficiency and making sure that, again, like if it's agents, we don't blow the agent context, right? Like we don't use all the tokens just to specify which tools to use.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if it's like a person developer, how do we don't push them to learn 10,000 tools to just do one thing?
Yeah. So when talking about developer experience, it's always about like fixing some pain points or making it easier, right? What would be sort of the main pain points that you see that developers facing today when they are sort of interacting with Kubernetes based platforms?
I think that like this is more like an industry opinion, right? Like there are tons of providers that will give you Kubernetes for development, right? Like developer environments that are basically Kubernetes based. And that's really good. But again, then the developer is forced to learn about what Kubernetes is and how it works, and then connect to maybe a remote environment to do that. The other way of doing it is like, no, well, like you push developers to think about, okay, what's your application? And that's going to run in a container. So you give them the tools to simulate like how the application will connect to other applications in a Kubernetes cluster. And tools like Teleport and like and Mirror D will help you to troubleshoot or run something inside the cluster and then just do debugging sessions and stuff like that. But still, it feels like the amount of tools is way too much. The experience is, again, it's not that Rails experience. It's not that like Heroku experience where I can code and then you will run it, and you will run it and you will scale it up and it will work. So I think that if you think about like what the book is about and what the term developer experience means in this case is helping business developers, like developers that are creating applications, to have that experience. How do you focus on building the business logic while other teams and the platform itself will focus on running that for you?
But how do platform teams then decide what to hide and what to expose and what to standardize for developers? How are they creating this,
Mhm.
basically API towards the developers?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question, and I think that that's company specific, like organization specific, right? Like it really depends on the maturity of the organization. There are organizations that have pushed development teams to learn Kubernetes, and at that point you can fork. You can create two options, right? Like one that it's more developer friendly, where you said, "Give me a repository, I will create a container and run it for you," perfectly fine. But also you provide all the escape hatches to go and touch like the behavior on the clusters, because like it's very difficult to create like a one size fit all tool or API that developers will use. If your API is not providing a feature that they need, they will find a way to bypass it, and then things go really wrong.
With your experience from the Dapper project
Mhm,
and the abstractions that a product like Dapper provides,
mhm.
how do they improve like the developer experience on top of Kubernetes, and why should teams be careful not to create over abstractions so we abstract too much away from our developers?
I tend to like that idea. I don't know where I've heard that, but I tend to like the idea of if you're creating APIs, you need to create APIs for like 80% of the use cases, right? And then just provide that escape hatch that you can just go and bypass the APIs for very specific reasons, right? I think that again from the Dapper experience and on another projects experiences like Spring, like the Spring community and the Java community, they heavily rely on a programming model, right? So it's all about like explaining what developers are supposed to do with these APIs and what these APIs were designed for, right? Because sometimes like if you provide an API but you don't provide that context of why this was designed in this way, developers will just developers will be developers, right? Like they will just go and use this and abuse the API in a lot of different ways. So providing that context is a mistake that I've seen in a lot of different communities, and that can be avoided by that just making sure that the programming model on top of those APIs is clear and consistent.
Then from segueing a little bit into observability, observability is often discussed as like an infrastructure or platform level. What does observability for developers mean in your view, and how is it different from platform and infrastructure observability?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that going back again to the book, right? Like that segmentation of inner loop is like what developers do and what they do a lot, right? Like this is like a loop where they are just coding, making changes, testing things, compared to kind of like the outer loop, which is like more CI. How do we deploy things in an environment? It's very different, right? Like the kind of tools that they use and the kind of work that they do there, right? One is like complete runtime, like application is running, and the other one is like we are stopping, starting things. We, as developers, we tend to think more about like ephemeral executions that runs once, but with all the agentic stuff coming up really really strong, I strongly believe that 26 and 27, like next year, will be the era of observability on the developer side of things, like the observability on the inner loop. And I'm really interested to see how, like for example, Dash Zero and other observability providers not pivot into that space, but like start extending the experience for development teams. When you have agents doing a bunch of different things and interacting with repositories, with services, and generating code, you want to see how much like different team members are using from that and how much they are producing, and not to validate what they produce, but more to understand kind of like the new ways of interacting and the new ways of building teams, right?
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
I am really interested to see now, like if you think about the inner loop with Cloud Code or any of the agents, right? Like you can have like 10 terminals open doing work at the same time. You need a way to see what's going on in these 10 terminals, and nowadays it's not that easy. It's like you finish your day and you have 10 terminals, you don't know what happened, you don't have any summary. So I do believe that observability is coming really strong in that space too.
And extending a little bit on that, how do you see it sort of evolving, like information from the outer loop going into the inner loop? So one example could be like having profiling running in your production environments and having that profile, come back into the inner loop to I don't know, fix some changes that needs to be optimized because you're, I don't know, memory leaking or whatever is the issue, right?
Yeah, and I think that that's something that it feels to me, right? Like, of course, this existed before platform engineering and all these new kind of like trends, but it feels to me that at least in the Kubernetes community, that question is much strong today, right? Like now we talk about, okay, how do we retrofit from the things that we are running into the development space, right? And I think that that question was the main reason why I joined like the developer experience tag at CNCF, because I want to make sure that projects in CNCF understand how to bring back, information to development teams. Right now, the tools are designed not for developers; they are designed for operations, as you mentioned before, and it's going to be extremely useful to get that back to developers, but also to the agents that developers are using to craft code, right, or to change code, because it's completely different to just fix a bug by just generating code and but fixing a bug based on some numbers that you already have from your production environment.
Yeah, and I think a project like OpenTelemetry in this space now starts to make a lot of like
Yeah,
sense, right? Because now you can standardize on
profiling.
different
Yeah,
formats that
yeah.
every project is now standardizing on. We call this thing this, those values or these values are the possible values that this can take.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that is very easy for an LLM to like interpret and work on. So I think that is a very interesting sort of development that if we can push like the
Yeah.
every project to be as uniform in
Hmm.
their adoption of telemetry, the better for the developer, the better for
Hmm.
the community in general.
Hmm.
But I think I totally agree with you. There's a lot of work still to be done in this space, especially many projects are like designing for debugging for maintainers, not for developers. So there's some
Exactly.
interesting perspectives there, definitely.
Yeah, and I don't know if like the audience kind of like is super familiar with the profiling aspect of open telemetry, right? For me, it was mind blowing that you can run profiling on, for example, on your production environments, where you can actually see from from the operating system level to the application level all the things that are going on, right? So when I was writing the book, that wasn't available. I haven't seen any of those solutions, and it was something that it was very difficult to explain to people, like how do you evaluate if one of the open source tools that you're using on top of Kubernetes is causing you problems, right? And I didn't have any answers for that. Like it's more like, okay, you install this and you trust that this is going to scale, but in reality you need to actually understand the entire stack and being able to profile or understand how all the things that are running impact your applications. So for me, profiling is a huge advantage. And yeah, and on the standardization, I think that something that is keeping me awake at night is that thinking of open telemetry was created for observability, right? And providers rely on that to understand, like get data and then just display that data to the user, right? The same way that tools for developers are created for developers and whatever like output they provide are for developers. None of those things were designed for agents. So it feels to me that we will go through a phase where we start tweaking. So we have open telemetry, but for agents. So we can export the data in a way that an agent can consume that and it's not extremely verbose, or profiles. So you can actually get very specific things that agents can use. I haven't seen that change happening in developer tooling, but I know it's coming, right? If I'm running
Definitely.
this tool to build my application, I want an output that it's more accessible for agents than for human.
Definitely. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's some exciting stuff coming in this space. I'm pretty sure of that as well.
yeah.
Now I think one other topic that is like upcoming these days or very popular these days is treating your platform as a product. And I think this ties very much into the discussion around developer experience and platform engineering as well. But also observability, because how do you actually measure like the success of like a platform, like an abstraction that you created for your developers? What signals or metrics would you recommend in measuring like developer experience or platform effectiveness without like falling into vanity metrics?
It's funny because, like, again, when you think about like, let's create this platform team inside this organization to create a platform, right? For me, that would be kind of like not the best way of doing it. It would be more like, let's create a platform to solve this very particular challenge, right? Or this set of use cases. So the moment that you introduce a platform, you can validate if you're actually improving those use cases or not, and the automation, like automation on those use cases. For me, platform engineering at the end of the day, it's all about automating tasks, so people do not need to, do stuff that it's not needed and can be automated. But of course, because this is coming from the Kubernetes side of things, we focused a lot on infrastructure, right? It's about how do you provision clusters, how do you provision projects or applications, how do you deploy, do GitOps on top of clusters, and those things. For those things, we have tools that are automated, right? So I think that I would focus more on that, like the internal business teams outcomes that you can get, right? Like, so how much does it take to onboard an application? How much time does it take to create a release, for example?
Yeah, yeah.
Because like on the developer experience side, you cannot focus on how many PRs a developer creates or how many lines of code do they change, because that's not useful at all right now. I don't think that it contributes to the discussion.
No, no, I totally agree. It's about measuring the time you're saving or like the value you're producing
Yeah.
for your developers, so they can actually focus on whatever task they have, right?
So I would say that, like, if you are trying to measure developer experience, I would just create a simple list of, okay, today these are the tools that developers need to learn in order to do their day-to-day tasks, right?
Yeah.
And if we can do whatever in the platform to reduce that number or to provide a programming model that abstracts away some of those tools, and the platform takes the lead on saying, okay, no, you don't need to know how to create a container. We will create a container for you, for example, right? And where do you draw the lines? I think that that's how I would do it, because yeah, like metrics for just the sake of having metrics. Yeah, I'm not a very big fan of that approach.
No, and I guess I think like a couple of years ago there was a few talks at KubeCon as well around developer happiness scores or something like that. Start simple, get some feedback at least. If you are working as a platform team, you should talk to your developers, get some feedback on how it's performing, what the value it brings, right? And
Yeah. And I think that that's kind of like another common mistake, right? Like when you have like an isolated platform team that do not talk to developers, right?
yes,
Because again,
definitely,
developers will find a way to escape whatever the platform teams provide. They will just do whatever they want. So
exactly.
getting them involved is again, it's not a technical thing, but it's a thing that you must do.
Exactly. So in November last year, you published a blog post called "The Evolution of Platforms: Gen.AI Edition," and that was very much focused on like GenAI in the platform engineering space. What patterns are you seeing emerge? And yeah, basically, can you talk a little bit more about like GenAI from a platform engineering perspective? What we'll see in the next coming month or maybe even years?
Yeah, I think that like that's an evolving space, right? For me personally, right? Like again, because as you can see, like my background is development, right? So I do empathize a lot with more like developers than operations. But when you think about like Gen AI in the context of Kubernetes, right? I did a presentation with my friend Alexa from Bloomberg, where we discussed like about like how these companies start providing AI or LLM models as services for internal teams, right? That's, I would say that that's the main thing that the platform team will do, is like how do you enable some AI enabled features or LLMs for internal teams to do work. And that takes you into different spaces. One is what tools do you give developers to interact with the LLMs, right? Like which SDKs and gateways and rate limiting and token filters and all that stuff. While you look into the other side is how do you use GPUs to run these models efficiently, right? So for me, like, and if you go to any KubeCon or CNCF event, you will see that kind of like, okay, this is all about like running workloads that require CPUs and all the tools that you need to do that, like BLLM and all the DRA and all that stuff in Kubernetes, which I find it extremely interesting. But again, it's very infra focused, right? Like that's for infra people. On my side as a developer, I'm interested about like how do I consume these things as a developer, right? Like from my machine, or how do I conceptualize what's going to be available in the platform where I'm going to run my applications, right? And I've seen a lot of things going on that space. Is kind of like you have like the Docker approach of we will let you run models locally. That's one way. The other approach is just pay for your cloud service, and then we will put a gateway in the middle, so to provide access to developers. But something that I described in that article is all about like, okay, as a developer now I need to learn about new stuff like RAG. right? Like retrieval augmented information, right? I need to understand these patterns in order to plan my applications correctly and make sure that agents or any LLM can have the right information to use, that it's according the organization where I'm working on, right? For me, that was a big revelation on APIs, for example, right? Like platform APIs, or something that I described there in the article is about that, is how do we soften those contracts, right? How do we create the right tools for agents to use our platforms as well, so we can provide further automation.
Yeah, and it's very different, right, from what we are coming from, and especially also from an observability perspective, right? How do you provide like insights into what the LLMs is doing? Because it's not just a single request response anymore. It's multiple LLM calls. It's between different agents. It's tool calls. It may be even skills. There's all kinds of things involved in this space, right? So how do we then like expose the right things to our developers, and how do we make sense of very all of these things going forward?
And personally, as you might know, right, like I'm more focused on how do you make that reliable and reproducible, right?
Yeah.
So part of the things that we are doing on the Dapper projects and Dapper agents is all about that. It's like you have a long running interaction of services and tools and agents and stuff. How do you make sure that if something fails, you can keep doing the work without like rerunning everything from the beginning, right? Because at the end of the day, like like tokens are limited, and you need to be efficient with that. I think that today, like, or 2025 was a year where we didn't care. We just used as many tokens as we want. But that's not longer the case. And I think that tools are getting better, but we still need to have the right policies and filters in place to do it in the right way.
Yeah, and I think that's also one of the things that you mentioned in the blog post as well, is
Mhm.
that at least I know that you mentioned that Kyverno and
Yeah.
Kagent are doing some things so that
Mhm.
at least you introduce some policies in your cluster to make sure that you're
Yeah.
not providing all the access to the agents, so that potentially they could delete
Yeah.
everything, right?
Yeah. And that's a hot topic nowadays, right? Like, I think that when I wrote the book, for example, I knew that identity will be one thing, right? Nowadays, if you think about creating a platform that spans across cloud providers, the main challenge that you will face is like how this service in this cloud provider go and access S3 in a different, like, like buckets in a different cloud provider, right? How do you do that in a way that is controlled but also has the right like policies to check before going and executing whatever, and how the identity from one workload propagates to a different provider, right? So I think that there's a lot of work being done there with Spiffy and Spire, and I really want to see that materialize, and I'm really curious about how that relates to the observability story, right? How can we check identities, like, like from the open telemetry point of view, and then see, okay, this identity did all these things. That will be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, also from a platform engineering perspective, right? I think the role of platform engineers in this AI space is also a little
Yeah.
bit different. Now they need
Mhm.
to maybe it's not different. It's probably the same thing, but now you're dealing with new tools as well, like a completely new landscape of different categories of
Mhm.
tooling that you are now need to provide. You need to stitch them together. You need to create abstractions
Yeah.
and expose them to your developers in ways you haven't tried before.
And the big problem is that, at least not the problem, but the challenge is that tools are being created every day. They keep changing, and they were not designed for Kubernetes, right? While most, LLM providers, they run their models on Kubernetes. So this is kind of like a big gap where like we have tools that are not designed to work with Kubernetes, but at the same time they are using Kubernetes to run models. So it's like there's a big gap there. There is a big gap that needs to be fixed in some way, and I think that we will just keep pushing there. But as with everything, right? Like even with Linux and with Kubernetes, everything takes time. We need to go through a couple of iterations of companies building these large scale platforms with AI, and then we will come up with the right tools to standardize that for the rest of the world.
Definitely. So for platform teams listening today who want to improve developer experience on Kubernetes, what is
Mhm.
one like practical step they can take this week to make like measurable progress to sort of wrap this up?
From a platform team perspective, I think that having that practice of including developers into the platform discussion will lead you to figure out which libraries you can create across development teams to standardize work. So how do you do logging? How do you do, again, like telemetry? How do you instrument different applications across teams? I think that that's extremely valuable. The Dapper project helps you in that regards, but I think that having those discussions with your development teams it's a practical step to go in the right direction. I think that if you are in the Kubernetes space, you think about like a platform API as an extension to the Kubernetes APIs. I encourage platform teams to go further and thinking about, okay, library distribution, standardization across languages, and actually abstracting away infrastructure. Think about like what would be the first thing that you can abstract away from your infrastructure that will enable developers to have the same experience locally that remotely in your production environments. I think that would be something that I encourage people to think about.
Awesome. Mauricio, thank you so much for joining us on Code Red. This was a fantastic conversation, and I think a lot of listeners will walk away with a much clearer understanding of what platform engineering on Kubernetes really means, and also why developer experience has to be like the center of all of this.
We are heading there. I do see companies focusing on that. So, like, please do share my Twitter handle and my Blue Sky handle and my LinkedIn if people wants to reach out. I'm always happy to mentor people on open source projects and help them contribute. So, if you are listening and you want to join an open source project, reach out. Let's have a chat and let's start with your open source journey.
For those listening, I hope today's episode helped clarify how platforms, observability, and even GenAI fit together when the goal is enabling developers rather than overwhelming them. We'll include links to Mauricio's book, Platform Engineering on Kubernetes, and his blog post, The Evolution of Platforms, GenAI, the edition, in the episode description. Thanks again for tuning in. I'm excited to continue these deep dives into platform engineering, developer experience, and the people shaping the cloud native ecosystem. We'll see you in the next episode.